Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight. Editor-at-Large for The Australian, journalist and author Paul Kelly. The Shadow Human Services Minister, Linda Burney. Nobel Prize winner and pioneer of microloans to combat global poverty, Muhammad Yunus. The first female Prime Minister of Denmark, who now heads Save the Children International, Helle Thorning-Schmidt. And Environment and Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Please welcome our panel. Well now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in Eastern Australia, live everywhere else on News 24 at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. And you can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope. Well, as you'll have noticed, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is not on the panel tonight. Our first question relates to that. It comes from Peter Nespal.
Thank you. Firstly, can I just express my disappointment that Ayaan is not on the panel tonight? Last time Ayaan was on this program, the rise of regressive liberalism and fundamentalist Islam and the erosion of free speech was discussed. Given the cancellation of her Australian tour due to security concerns, it's clear to me that nothing much has changed. Does the panel agree that Australian politicians, media outlets and public figures should be doing more to defend the right to critique all religions, including Islam?
Just before we go to the panellists, we should clarify that Ayaan Hirsi Ali Foundation identified security as just one of a number of factors leading to the cancellation. Josh Frydenberg, what about the question?
Well, I've read Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book on titled Infidel, and I must say that she has been a picture of bravery if you look through her life. And in fact, she demonstrates that the pen is much mightier than the sword. I think that it's very regrettable that people have sought to prevent her coming to Australia because they see her as the enemy of tolerance, where I see her as an enemy of intolerance. And personally, I don't agree with everything that she has said about Islam, but it's interesting to see that she has received support more broadly, for example, from the President of Egypt, President al-Sisi, who's talked about the need for reform within Islam. And she sends a very powerful message as well about how secular law should be above Sharia law. So I think we must protect and promote freedom of speech. As you know, we've had a heated debate in the Parliament about reforming Section 18C. But I went onto the website tonight, the change.org website, to see the petition that was expressing their disappointment that she was coming to Australia. And I was shocked. I was shocked to see psychologists, doctors, lawyers, community activists all agree that she shouldn't be coming here to Australia to speak her mind. She is somebody who's gone through
I'm just going to interrupt you there. I mean,
pain.
if you saw the petition, there are less than 400 signatures on it. It was hardly a kind of groundswell of opinion trying to stop her from coming here. And indeed, the police who we spoke to said that there was going to be a demonstration outside the ABC, but there weren't enough people to actually make up a demonstration. So it does seem the security issues are a little bit exaggerated.
Well, if you look around the world, extremist Islam has been responsible for a number of very serious security incidents, so you can't take that lightly.
Yeah.
I defer to the experts.
Oh no, I mean there's no question. I mean she obviously has a situation where someone who made a documentary film about her was murdered, but I'm simply saying there didn't seem to be a huge groundswell here, from what we could see from the petition anyway.
Well, Tony, my view is that she would have received a lot of support here in Australia for airing what is somewhat controversial views, and she should be allowed to speak her mind, and people who disagree with her should be able to challenge that. That's the point of a free country like Australia.
Let's hear from both the politicians. Linda Burney.
Thank you for your question. I don't know the details precisely of why our panellists didn't come tonight, except one of the reasons she gave was security. And Josh has just referred to the debate we've just had, the unedifying debate we've just had in the Australian Parliament on 18C and freedom of speech. And it seems a little ironic that the party that was arguing against freedom of speech would propose it here tonight. But your question was about what people like politicians and media should be doing to promote freedom of speech. And I think it's our responsibility. But freedom of speech also comes with the view that other people can have different opinions, and it's the mix of those opinions which is important.
Now, just very briefly, the questioner also suggested there's an incompatibility between fundamentalist Islam and free expression. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that and I see that in the electorate that I represent. There are many people from many faiths around the world, and freedom of speech is held very highly and very importantly by all of those people. And the implication that somehow or rather one particular faith shuts down freedom of speech, I don't think is an accurate one, certainly in Australia.
Paul Kelly.
I agree with you. I think it's a great shame that she's not here tonight. I think we've got to be a little bit careful because we can't precisely know what the reasons were. I agree with Tony, however. I do think that the overwhelming majority of the Australian people would have been prepared to welcome her to this country. I am disturbed at the fact that we have a petition signed by about 400 people, some of them quite prominent, suggesting that she should not come to this country. I think this is contrary to the fundamental values of Australian democracy. This is a courageous and inspiring woman. Now, I don't agree with all her positions, but she certainly raised fundamental questions about Islam, which we should be prepared to debate as a society, debate and confront frankly. And I don't think there's any place at all for people to argue, well, we can't have those debates. We are not strong enough as a society to have those debates.
Paul, so the petition, to be fair, expressed utmost disappointment that she was coming. It didn't actually suggest that she be refused entry or that she shouldn't come. It did accuse her of hate-mongering, but it stopped short of asking for the tour to be stopped.
I think the petition made it very clear that she was not welcome in this country. I think that's wrong. I mean, this is a person who's had a very prominent role to play in the global debate about Islam. She's directing herself to issues which are highly relevant in this country at the moment, and we know that one of the problems with our public debate these days is there's too much of an effort on the part of certain groups to try and silence or shut down people in groups that have opposing views to them.
Hella, what do you think?
Well, I see here is Anna Lee, who I never met, but I read her book, Infidel, as a woman who, from a very, very personal experience, are fighting against some of the things that she had to experience. She had to experience, as far as I know, female genital mutilation. She had to enter into a forced marriage. We see many of these girls still existing, fighting that, and she was a voice and is a voice for those children that had to endure that brought about by their parents, basically. And that is why she should have a strong voice. And of course, I mean, for me, it's a completely no-brainer. This is Australia. There's freedom of speech. Of course, she should be able to come and speak her mind. You don't have to agree with someone because I don't necessarily agree with everything she says. But that's not the point when you talk about freedom of speech. The point is that I will fight for your right to say whatever you want, even though if you're not racist, even though I might not agree with you. So
what about for example, for my right or anyone's right to make a depiction in a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, which you saw in Denmark, the Danish cartoons, 2005.
No, but I had this, I mean, when I was Prime Minister and leader of the opposition, I mean, we had a number of incidents. I mean, for Christ's sake, we had a terror attack, someone attacking a political meeting, someone who came over from Sweden who wanted to debate something.
That was actually one of the cartoonists who'd made one of those depictions of the Prophet. And if I understand it correctly, the event was a free speech forum.
It was a free speech forum. It was perfectly good arrangement Saturday afternoon, and we had someone commit a terror attack and kill just this ordinary guy who came to a meeting on a Saturday afternoon to discuss freedom of speech. And I think it's so simple for us to conclude that that is just not right. It's a crime, and we should not be spending time on discussing that. And of course, she should have the right to come to Australia to put her points of views across. This is what democracy is all about.
But nobody's denying the right.
No,
to
I
come
know
to
that.
Australia.
No, I know that, but there was a petition against it.
Mohammed Yunus, what do you think?
Well, the issues, I don't know the details, what I learned from here. The issues about Islam has been raised by all people, by Muslim scholars, by Muslim activists, non-Muslim activists. It's nothing new. You come up with your opinion about certain aspects of Islam and so on. But that should not go into a level of inciting people, exciting people, and kind of bring intolerance into the discussion. That's the key thing is intolerance. It's nothing else. You do it in a friendly way. You point out what it is. If a large number of Muslims are angry with her, there's something missing in her tone, in her voice, in her way presenting the case. So I would say the basic...
She is pretty tough in the way that she presents her case.
But
in the end, she's calling for a complete reformation of Islam. Do you think that's a message that's accepted widely in Islamic communities?
That's up to the Muslims to decide whether this is acceptable or not. The question is, as I said, this is the language, the tone has to be something that you see she has something, a purpose of kind of solving the problem rather than aggravate the problem. Sometimes you talk about the freedom of speech, but that doesn't give you the license to insult somebody through your freedom of speech, cut down the respect and things that the other people hit the feelings of other people. So how to make it happen in a way you get across your views, at the same time you're not doing something, some byproduct of it which is completely unacceptable. So that's where the line to be drawn. Nobody is against the freedom of speech, but that gives you a responsibility.
All right.
Gives you
I don't agree with that. I think
Sure.
if you have freedom of speech, you can also insult people. And I think a lot of the freedom...
You know, there's been a huge debate about that here in Australia.
I don't actually, I didn't know that, but I just come with my opinion, and I think...
Well, it's written, just to explain, it's written to the Anti-Discrimination Act 18C.
Against the law.
You can't insult people.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, but for example, when the women were fighting for their rights in the 60s and the 70s, I think that a lot of people thought they had a very insulting tone to some of the men they were fighting against. So I think I think you have to use a language, not an insulting language if you can avoid it, but I think you can't limit freedom of speech.
Yes,
Well,
but you can be responsible with how you use it, and that's the...
Oh, yeah, I think we should all be
I think-
responsible.
well, I
I
think
think
one
that's what's lacking in the world, that there's not enough responsibility to how we use our...
We've got so many questions to get through. I'm sorry to interrupt you there. We've got former Prime Minister. We've got so many questions to get through. Let's go to one from Mamta Chowdhury.
My question is to Honourable Minister and Environment Minister Josh Frydenberg. Given the vast size and sources of our natural resources like water, wind, and sun, do you foresee a time, very near future, when we can replace or design our environmental policy by replacing our dependency on fossil fuel to the renewable energy, just like Denmark's admirable success in that sector?
Well, thank you.
Josh Frydenberg.
Look, the transition is underway. We have seen already a dramatic increase in the amount of renewable energy into the system, and that's encouraged by the government because we have signed on to what is called a mandatory renewable energy target.
Josh, I know that a lot of people have heard some of that detail, so let me just quickly go to that business about Denmark, since we have a former Prime Minister of Denmark here with us. They have they derive their electricity from 57% renewable energy, 43% wind energy. Seems like it can be done. Do we not have enough wind in Australia? Do we not have enough sun?
We actually have the highest per capita amounts of wind and sun anywhere in the world. One of the differences between us and Denmark is we're 180 times bigger as a country, and there are real issues to do with the transmission lines and, you know, spreading the energy across a large country. But one of the differences between Australia and Denmark is that they are connected to other countries in a way that Australia can't be. So, for example, Germany and Sweden provide nuclear power into Denmark, and Germany also provides some coal-fired power. Australia, because we're an island, we don't rely on any other country like they do in Europe. But the transition is underway. We're at the forefront of some amazing new technologies, some smart grids which are enabling regional and rural communities to tap into their own energy source. We have the highest uptake of solar panels on people's roofs anywhere in the world on a per capita basis. So the answer to your question is the technology is moving. Battery storage is the big unknown, but the prices are coming down. And things like Snowy Hydro scheme, which is investing records amount in hydropower and what is called pumped hydro power, is very exciting.
Josh, just very briefly on this, but there does seem to be, the government seems to be putting forward the notion that wind power is unreliable, that you can't get a reliable electricity system up and running, relying solely on wind power at least. I'd just like to quickly get your answer. Could you ever reach, or could you even conceive of reaching 43% of power in Australia coming from wind, since, as you point out yourself, we're the windiest country in the world?
Well, it's probably not going to be when I'm the Energy Minister, but it will be in time, very high levels of renewable penetration into the grid. But Tony, to your actual question, South Australia has seen nearly 40% of their power come from wind. So they've been the big experiment, not just in Australia, but for much of the world. One of the challenges they've faced is on one day, wind has provided 100% of the power for South Australia, and on another day, zero. And that's a level of intermittency which is very hard to deal with, particularly when battery storage is still being developed. So it's an engineering challenge, it's not an ideological one.
Can I just interrupt you there? Because I know I'd quite like to hear how it's actually done in a country where this seems to be working, to see why it couldn't happen here. So, Helle, how do you manage to do it in Denmark?
I think the minister's right. There is a grid that we have in Europe where if someone has a surplus of energy, you actually export it really, really easily, and particularly between the Nordic countries. It's not because we are reliant on nuclear energy. That would simply be a wrong conclusion. So, but there is a grid, and of course you can't have that here. But you have to have a good energy mix. You have to have a good energy mix of wind, solar, biomass, waste burning, which is can be a good business as well, actually. So you have to have the good mix, but the thing is, you can't do anything without investment. We started 30 years ago investing in this, and it's really a big investment to get to that stage. But now we're in a situation that a lot of what we export in Denmark is actually a bigger export than our agricultural production, which says a lot about an old agricultural country. So I'm not suggesting you can use the same solutions, but it certainly takes a variety of sources of energy, and also big conscious effort to get to that stage.
So briefly, what happens, because in South Australia, when the minister's right, the wind stops, you get blackouts. How do you prevent that?
That's why you have to have the mix, where you have a little bit of coal, you have a little bit of solar, you have a mix of energy, so you never run out of energy.
And lots of batteries.
When you never run out of energy, I think if you think it through in a good way, it is possible. It does require investment, and often investment will require political will.
Let's go across the panel. Political will. Linda Burney, you have a different perspective.
I have a very different perspective. I think one of the most ridiculous things I have seen since becoming a federal member of Parliament is the Treasurer walking into the Parliament with a lump of coal. It was baffling. And it seems to me that the debate, and I think your question's a fantastic one, but the debate that we've had in the federal parliament over the last month about energy completely ignores the fact that we have an enormous issue with global warming. And it seems like it's almost back to the future and coal is king again. and it was pure politics, absolute pure politics. And the idea that somehow or rather the great announcement by the Prime Minister about Snowy Mountain 2020 or whatever it's called, it's a feasibility study. That's what it is. And the Snowy Mountain is not going to be the Snowy Mountain Mark II is not the answer to the Australian energy needs. I think that what we really should be having from the government is a proper plan. Labor is committed to targets and...
Can I say, it would be pretty good to get more hydroelectricity, wouldn't it?
It would be very good, but you can't...
Do you have a problem with that in principle?
No, I don't have a problem in principle. What I have is the way in which it's come about. I don't know if you all saw the episode of, was it the show, the political...
I'm not sure which one you mean, a satirical show.
Yeah, that was, you go in and say, Prime Minister, we've got to have a plan in 3 weeks for something huge, and we ended up with a Snowy Mountain 2020. That's what it was really like.
Sounds like Yes, Prime Minister,
yes,
but
Prime
they don't
Minister,
have hydro
yes.
in Britain.
It was amazing.
Let's go to Paul Kelly. What do you think?
Utopia.
Utopia.
That's
so
it.
the
It's
Australian...
like an episode out of Utopia.
Well done.
Well,
Paul Kelly, do we live in utopia or something?
No, we don't live in
slightly
utopia. Essentially what's happened in this area is the political system, the system of politics, the system of public policy making has failed the country. We've got very high energy prices. They are likely to get higher. This is going to do tangible damage to the Australian economy. There is a great risk here to jobs. And essentially what's happened is that there is a real problem getting new investment into the energy sector. And the reason for that is the guidelines aren't clear, the rules aren't clear. You've got opposing sides of politics with completely different policies. So while you've got that degree of uncertainty, there's going to be a great reluctance on the part of the investment community to make the investments we need and make them promptly in terms of addressing these issues. And remember, there are 3 tasks here which both sides of politics essentially agree on. That is, we've got to make the transition in terms of emission reductions according to our commitments under the Paris Accords. We've got to try and do it in a way that doesn't do too much damage to the economy on the cost side. And of course, we've got to ensure that the system doesn't falter, that we don't have the sort of blackouts which we've been having in South Australia.
And of course, Tony, we must remember, in all seriousness, it's not just the federal governments that make energy policy. It's got a lot to do with state governments and the coordination with state governments, and the role of state governments is very important in this discussion.
And can I just say about, I mean, we mustn't forget that this question was also about climate change. That's what is also about this conversation. And climate change is actually real, it's happening. And I just saw figures showing that about 20 million people per year becomes refugees because of climate change. A drought that will lead to a famine, people have to root up everything and leave. And we are seeing unprecedented numbers of refugees as it is. In not too many years, we will have to add to that climate refugees. So I don't think any of us can back out of this discussion. This is a real issue, and no one can solve this alone, but every country can play its part.
Very, very briefly, are you making an argument there against coal?
I mean, renewable energy is not coal. I believe that we would have a better future for a lot of people if we actually are serious about combating climate change. This is what we've all promised in the Paris Agreement. And that means that we have to stop using the fossil energy sources and move into renewables.
OK, now I'd like to hear from Mohammed on this. And it's a huge issue because, I mean, for example, if you were to go to India now, they would say we've lifted tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, in China as well, out of poverty by using coal-fired power. You're about lifting people out of poverty. Good or bad?
Let me put it this way. Is the strength of the commitment to come to the renewable energy. that determines everything else. I mean, if you not quite sure how far we want to go, how quickly we want to go, then we'll never get there. It has to be very clear that this is what we're going to do. We forget about the fossil fuel, forget about everything else. It temporarily has to do, it's a kind of reluctantly we'll do it. But that's the aim and objective is very clear. Because then that's when the technology will come. Because technology is the intensity of your desire that brings the technology. And also the other methods of introducing renewable energy. Like for our example, in Bangladesh, you talked about the climate refugees. Bangladesh is one of the big candidates, which will be coming up with lots of climate refugees very soon. Bangladesh, 22 years back, we started a small company to provide solar energy in Bangladesh called Grameen Shakti. Because 70% of the people of Bangladesh have no access to electricity at all. So you see kerosene lamps in villages and so on and so forth. So we thought, why don't we bring solar energy? Everybody said, Bangladesh, solar energy, doesn't really match. This is good for Europe, good for other countries, not for Bangladesh. I said, why not? Let's try. So we created that company to sell solar home system as a social business. Not to make money, but to make sure people have electricity in their home, made out of their own plant. Solar energy plant. In the beginning, it's very difficult. Selling 5 or 6 solar home systems per month was such a difficult task. People will not believe what they said. It's a kind of magic or something you're talking about. Because they never saw it. How can you create electricity out of nothing?
Yeah.
But we pursued, we continued to explain. We tell them whatever money you are spending on kerosene every month, you just keep the money that you spend on kerosene. And we install the solar home system right today. And every month you give me the kerosene money. You can do it over 3 years. And all the money is paid off. Everything is free now. You don't have to pay anybody anything. You have no kerosene cost. It became so popular. Today we have 1.8 million homes with solar energy. So we are not government. We are not.
I'm going to interrupt you there because we're going to come back to some of the other extraordinary success stories of the Green Bank in particular. Now, the next question is slightly different. It comes from Torsten Lehmann.
Yeah, okay, so during the last few decades, we have seen a growing inequity in wealth distribution. So I would like to ask the panel members what sort of impacts that has on our societies and what can be done about any negative impacts.
I'll start again with Mohammed here. Growing inequity in the country, something you've talked about a good deal.
Absolutely. This is the most worrying thing. I keep talking about ticking time bomb that's coming out of this.
Why a ticking time bomb?
Because the way concentration is getting worse and worse every day.
Concentration of wealth.
Wealth is becoming worse. We were told 62 people in the world owns more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population of the world. This year we are told 8 people in the world own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. What is the message coming next year? 1 person in the world is owning more wealth than the bottom 50%. So that's the direction we are going.
Tell us why that is dangerous. Because you've said it's dangerous.
It's dangerous.
Why is it dangerous? Are you talking about revolution?
Yes, 1%. Maybe, or maybe worse than that. 1% of population in the whole world own 99% of the wealth of the entire world. So what is left for the 99% of the people? 1% of the wealth. And it is getting smaller on the wealth side, larger on the population side. So that's not a sustainable society. You can't watch people get everything getting on the top and I'm not getting anything. So this disrupts society and relationship, governance and so on. That intention, that feeling passes on to politics, passes on to society. And now our politics is blaming each other that they are.
Before you know it, you elect a billionaire.
Yeah, we elect a billionaire. Why? Because we incited people that, look, your problem is because the foreigners are coming, taking away your job. Yeah. Mexicans are coming, taking your job. East Europeans are coming, taking your job. So you get to the Brexit because you are so angry with the people that I don't get anything. And then they vote somebody who says, I will build the wall so that you have a better share of the income and so on, and we'll scrap all the trade deals because the jobs are getting away from our country. So those kind of messengers who give you the wrong kind of messages to incite you get elected. Yeah. That's the danger part of it, and it gets worse as we go along. So that's the ticking time bomb is societies will fall apart. because you cannot continue with this kind of continuation of concentration.
Let's go around. Let's go around the panel, and well, I'll start with Hilla. Actually, it's interesting that he mentioned Donald Trump. In fact, I did, I suppose, but it does seem that one of the highest concentrations of wealth anywhere would have to be in the Trump administration. As we've now seen, the president is a billionaire himself. Many of his team have amassed these huge personal fortunes, more than 100 million in many cases. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is worth 580 million. The Secretary of Commerce, 326 million. The National Economic Council, Gary Cohn, 250 million. His son-in-law and advisor, Jared Kushner, 241 million. Secretary of State, 239 million. I mean, have you ever heard anything like this? A concentration of wealth within a political administration like this?
No, I haven't, but I don't actually think it's the most interesting question. Oh. Sorry to say that.
Then you can go on to the interesting part.
Mohammed's question is much more interesting. And enormous sums of wealth on very, very few hands globally, and how that is not sustainable in the long run. And it isn't. We have 350 million children living in extreme poverty. Not poverty, extreme poverty. That's about $2 a day we are talking about here. And this is a situation. And at the same time where we are talking about going to Mars, and I'm not against going to Mars, that's very, very exciting, we cannot eradicate extreme poverty. And we have, even though it is not something you talk about on a Monday morning when you get up and get on with your life and go to work, we still have to really focus in on figures like that and the figures that we hear here and ask ourselves, can this be changed? Can we do something to change that? And of course, it's governments that are most responsible for changing that.
I suppose that was my point in the end. Yeah. If the governments are full of people who are so wealthy, they seem to have no connection to the real world, does that change things?
I think governments, particularly in a lot of countries where they don't create a tax base, they will always have a difficult time creating some sort of equality in their countries. If you don't collect the taxes, you will not be able to have any services. You will not create a situation where the wealthy pays a little bit more than the poor people into the society, and where you socialize what you have. So you have to have a tax base, and that's one of the issues that we're saying, that governments actually have to avoid tax evasion. There's far too much tax evasion in the world, and create a tax base. But then we also have to look at ourselves and ask, how can we change this in a global way? And I hope that will become the next conversation we have to have. Now we talk about climate change, and hopefully we're not forgotten that that's a real issue. I think we should also look about these enormous inequalities that we have in our world, and a lot of too many children living in poverty.
Let's hear from Josh Frydenberg. Do you see this as perhaps the most dangerous issue facing the planet, as Mohammed seems to suggest?
Well, I think Mohammed made a very strong point, which is politicians are tending to blame globalisation for their mistakes or for their problems at home. And in the United States, we have seen real wages of the working middle class remain flat for some 3 decades. And I think that was part of the reason why Donald Trump surfed to power, because there was huge discontent among that group of workers. And now that we've had this quantitative easing, monetary policy which has seen low interest rates around the world, the impact of that has been to increase the value of capital, because lots of people can buy property now because the interest rates are low, or lots of other things, but decrease the relative value of labour. And actually lifting the price of capital and decreasing the value of labour is actually increasing global inequality, and I think that's a problem.
What about the idea that Hilla said you need to raise tax in order to defeat
I'd actually didn't say raise tax, I just create a tax base.
Well, you need to have a strong tax base. Well, I'm throwing this to Josh because essentially you just gave away $24 billion.
Not at all.
To corporate citizens whose businesses earn under 50 million.
Quite the contrary. Actually, what you've seen throughout many years.
But we just got
to do with your question.
That is the cost of the tax.
No,
is it not?
It's $21 billion over the next 10 years. But the point is that it will actually stimulate economic growth, because it will attract to Australia companies to invest or keep companies here who otherwise might be chasing a lower company tax rate. in the UK, which is going down to 17, 18%. The United States, Donald Trump has talked about a 15% company tax rate. And in Australia, at 30%, we're well above the OECD average and that of comparable Asian economies. And it's unfortunate that we didn't get bipartisan support for that, given that Bill Shorten and his shadow treasurer have been on the record supporting company tax.
So since you made that point, we'll quickly go to the Labor Party, because you did reject this tax cut, and you in fact referred to it as a dirty deal. But was a promise by the Prime Minister made in the election. So how can that be a dirty deal?
Well, I find it remarkable, and we've been discussing political issues across the world. I want to talk about what's going on here in our own country, where there is enormous gaps getting wider and wider between those that have money and those that don't. And we only have to look at the situation for Aboriginal people and the latest round of the Closing the Gap report, where the disparity is getting broader and broader. I also see, and going to your question, Tony, where we have a government that is creating huge amounts of money for those that can afford it through that taxation issue that you raised, and yet a government that is hell-bent on clawing back money from those that can least afford it through Centrelink, through people who are on welfare payments. And I find that quite incredible when you see the disparity that's opening up in Australia. Tony Vincent, the late Tony Vincent, some of you may know his work, and he talked about entrenched disadvantage and intergenerational disadvantage. And we need to remind ourselves that that exists in our own country, not just for First Peoples, but for many people that are living in second, third, fourth generation homes where there is not employment. And it seems to me, and I take the point that Paul Kelly is making, there are some things that need to be collective bipartisanship in terms of addressing those issues. And one of them is addressing the growing gap between the haves and have-nots in Australia. That is a reality in our own country. We can talk about the rest of the world, which is important, but don't forget we have this disparity in our own country.
Paul Kelly, you take that point, and does that make it harder for the Prime Minister to sell a tax cut to corporate citizens?
Well, it does make it harder, Tony. Look, to me, the essence of this issue is that we've got to do two things. We've got to improve economic growth. What we've seen over the course of the last decade are low levels of economic growth in much of the world since the global financial crisis. And this has had a very damaging impact across many, many countries and many, many societies. So we need policies that regenerate and renew economic growth and jobs. And then, matching that, we need policies that distribute the benefit of jobs. So we've got to get growth and we've got to get redistribution. Now, if we focus on one and not the other, regardless of which one it is, then we fail. And then there's going to be more concern, agitation and upheaval in our societies, the way we've seen what's been going on in parts of Europe and the United States. So I think one of the problems with our political debate in this country at the moment is one side of politics tends to focus on one of those priorities, the other side of politics tends to focus on the other priority, and what we've forgotten is how to put them together. Now, when it comes to Malcolm Turnbull's tax cuts, I think the government is essentially correct here. We do need to give tax cuts to the corporate sector. They employ 80% of the country. But the problem with the government's policies is that corporate tax cuts aren't enough. You need a whole range of other policies linking with that, whether we're talking now about productivity enhancement policies and then all sorts of other policies in terms of improving the equity and efficiency of the tax system. But what we've lost at the moment in this country is the magic that puts both together, and we had that in the 1980s.
OK, we're going to go from the macro to the micro. The next question is from Susie Haddock.
On the Grameen Bank website, I quote, it states, "We are especially committed to ensuring women benefit from the solutions we develop. In 2015-16, 94% of the citizens we reached were women." How does this change the dynamic? How does it impact on a traditional patriarchal society? And what are the long-term effects?
Mohammed.
Well, tremendously, because in a society where women are kept in the back, it's not, hardly you see women face anywhere, some 40, 50 years back in Bangladesh. To bring them out, give them the economic power to make their own decision, handle their own money, transforms them completely. That you are not dependent on anybody's income. You have your own income source, you have your own savings, you make your own decisions. Your decisions have value in the family because previously you had no value. So it transforms it. If Bangladesh particularly, if you see the most dramatic thing that happened to Bangladesh would be empowerment of women in the last 30 years, completely changed. And that transforms into impact on the children in the family. They are different kind of new generation that you get because mother is a completely different one. The equality between the husband and wife comes because you have economic power now. Before you didn't have anything, you were completely dependent on that.
Does it only work if you find people or if they come to you, to the Grameen Bank for these micro loans, who actually want to be entrepreneurs? I mean, it seems to be it's all really related to business in the end.
See, money is such a power. If you put money on the table, everybody comes to you. It's a very simple thing. So people who need it, they don't get it. So you're here, you said, I have the money, you come up with an idea. In the beginning, they said, what idea should I have? And you see your friend had an idea. Then you think, oh, I can do it better than her. Then suddenly you have an idea because your friend did it, something. So this is how the ideas come. Now we are addressing the second generation of Grameen families who went to school. First generation is totally illiterate. Never went to school, doesn't read, doesn't write. So we make sure the second generation don't have the same fate as their parents.
Mohammed, can I just interrupt you for a second? Because our questioner has a hand up, but I'd quite like to go back to Susan.
I guess my concern is that in a traditional patriarchal society, what impact does that have on the men, if any? Do they feel disempowered? And what is the root cause for why you have to approach women in the first place? And what are you doing about that?
Well, in the beginning, all we are trying to do is making sure that half the borrowers in my program are women. A very simple thing. Why? Because I was criticizing the banks in Bangladesh. They deny loans to the poor people. They deny loans to women of all income capacity. They don't give it. They challenged it. Why do I say that? I said, your statistics tell me that. Not even 1% of all the clients of all the banks happen to be women. I said something very wrong in your system. So in order to prove that that doesn't have to be that way, I made the decision half the borrowers will be women. And stick to that, despite the fact that women themselves say, no, don't give it to me, give it to my husband. I don't know anything about money. I said, no, we want to give it to you. You think about it, you can figure it out. So then we are telling our colleagues who are going to the women to persuade them, so I said, don't take no for an answer, because when a woman says no, it is not her voice, it's the voice of the history which created her. Because all the fears that accumulated around her is coming out as a voice of no, because I don't want to get involved with that. I said, we have to peel off that fear, layer by layer. And the real woman will come out and say, let me try. And if one of them tries, everybody say, how come? I'm not trying, I have to do it too. So that will be the beginning, and it would happen in 6 years' time. Then we 50-50. Then we saw money going to the family through women brought so much more benefit to the family than the money going to the family, same amount of money, but through men. So we said, why are we wasting our money? Why don't you channel it to the women? Because it brings so much benefit to the family.
Okay, I'm going to come... We'll come back to it, because at some point in the program you need to explain to us how this actually works.
Okay,
what you call a social business model. We've got another related question about women, though, and we'll go quickly to this from Celia Anderson-Cook.
Thanks, Tony. It's a sobering fact that every year 15 million children become brides, and childbirth is the second largest cause of death for adolescent girls. And according to the World Health Organization, 200 million young women and girls are living with genital mutilation. In light of this, do you think that modern feminism focuses too much on trivial issues? And how can we better protect young women around the world from these human rights violations?
Helle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking the question. This is a crazy situation. We've been sitting here, I don't know how long, but every 7 seconds, a girl under 15 actually gets married. And as you were saying, she has a very high risk of dying in childbirth. It's the second highest risk for, second highest cause of death for adolescent girls, as you were saying, after suicide. So the figures are quite crazy when you think about it. And the most important thing is, how can we get out of that very dangerous circles that these children are in? Because as soon as you get married, of course, you run a risk of early dying in childbirth, but there's very little chance for you to get an education. You have very little power in the family. If you don't have fiscal literacy, as we're talking about here, you have very little power. You don't have the capacity to space your pregnancies. You can't get a livelihood. I mean, there's so many doors that close around this girl as soon as she enters into that marriage. And that is why one of the things that we do in Save the Children is to fight against child marriage. It's not that easy. It's not that easy because it's not only talking to the governments and changing the legislation. We do that as well. We talk to all governments that need to change that legislation, but it's also getting into communities, asking them, why do you keep doing this? It's getting into the families and ask them, what brings you to marry off your little girls so early? And it's also getting into having a conversation with the girls themselves. And I've seen amazing programs for Save the Children, for example, where we actually get girls together and try to influence them and influence their community so that this very, very harmful practice stops. It has to stop. It is not fair to those girls. And we also hear the figures. And this is not only about our moral, what we have to be doing, but it's also about if girls were more empowered economically as well, the world would actually be a richer place, and we would all be much more wealthy if girls were economically empowered as well. And a child marriage stops that immediately.
Josh, what do you think of these figures? They're sobering, to say the least.
Yeah, and can I congratulate Helle for Save the Children and Mohammed for the work that he's done. I mean, truly groundbreaking work. The government works with Save the Children in Afghanistan and Myanmar, and one of the areas that we're focusing on is education, because if you can get some 30,000 extra children, as we are doing in Myanmar, into school, who otherwise wouldn't be there, or places like Mindanao in the Philippines, which has been subject to enormous amounts of violence, then you can get them a fresh start and you can give them a real chance in life. So these numbers are terrible, they're unacceptable. Through the aid program, we're doing a lot of work with maternal health. Pretty close to Australia, our nearest neighbour, Papua New Guinea, has very high numbers of child death mortality, infant mortality numbers. So it really is happening close to home. And
you've been criticised for cutting aid, though, haven't you? So, I mean, are you going backwards at the same time that you're spruiking these policies?
In the 16-17 year, we've contributed $3.8 billion to our aid program. It puts us as the 12th highest in the OECD. Of course, there are lots of demands on the budget.
Can I just say, because I set it up because Helle just looked across at me, so I'd just like to quickly give her a chance to jump in there.
Sure.
I'm a foreigner, and I shouldn't be telling Australia what Australia should be doing.
Go on.
And I know how annoying it is when someone comes in from abroad and sort of raise their finger. But this is an amazing country. There's so much compassion in this country. There's so much generosity of spirit in this country. And the only thing I can say is that when you're foreign, your development budget is at an all-time low, which it is right now, it feels like Australia is not taking its place in the world.
We're the 12th highest.
Okay, go across to...
We kind of miss you. We miss Australia. Australia should be big, influential, taking your space, helping in humanitarian situations, helping with development, and you are doing that.
Hang on. Helle.
It would be better.
Josh, I'll give you a chance to come back.
A little bit more.
I'm going to hear from Linda first.
Just briefly, And thank you for raising, I think, what's a very serious and important issue. And once again, it's an issue that we need to face in Australia as much as across the world. It's archaic, and it's about the subjugation of women. I often hear the argument, well, it's got a cultural base, and if it does, then I'd like someone to explain that to me. I think it's more about ideology, and often it's there's an economic reason, be it poverty, for child marriage. But I can just say one story and that I'd like to share with you. Some years ago, I was criticised because there was the situation of an older Aboriginal man who was with a younger Aboriginal woman through traditional relationships, and she was being mistreated. I was asked about that, and I said, if that is still part of our traditional culture, then that is a part that needs to change. And I stick by that particular view, because there is no place in any society for child marriage, and there is no place for the sorts of statistics that Hella has spoken about. It is archaic and it subjugates women.
Paul, do you want to jump in on the foreign aid question?
Well, Australia should be doing a lot better than what we're doing at the moment. I think the foreign aid budget is down to about 0.22% of GDP. That's unsatisfactory for us. About 10 years ago, it was the goal of both sides of politics to get the budget up to 0.5%. Now, in office, Labor made some very substantial initial efforts to get there, then fell away substantially. Under the period of coalition government since 2013, there have been very significant reductions in the overall percentage. So I think what's required is for us to look at the situation and try and track back upwards. But I'd make a couple of other points. There is not much political momentum in this country when you look at the overall political debate for increases in Australian foreign aid. If you look at the left of politics, this is not a front-line issue for the left of politics at all. They're interested in other things, and this, of course, this facilitates the situation when you've got a Conservative government in office, which is looking for savings, and a very easy form of savings is to cut the foreign aid budget because foreigners don't vote in this country.
I'm going to, Josh, 30 seconds on this because we have to get to other questions, but you do get a right of reply. But it does sound like the huge programs you're talking about have been severely shrunken.
Well, what we've done is we've refocused the funding towards our part of the world.
That's what everyone says when they shrink the budget. We've refocused.
Well, Kevin Rudd had some ulterior motives for spending a lot of money in Africa, I have to say, but we have devoted 90% of our aid budget to Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we see ourselves as having a huge responsibility in the Pacific. In fact, you know, if you look at some of the disasters and the cyclones that they've had to deal with in places like Vanuatu and Fiji, Australia has been the first responder. What we're doing in Papua New Guinea on tuberculosis, what we're doing in the Philippines on education, what we're doing around maternal health in a lot of Asia is
But is it more with less in fewer places?
Well, one of the things that Julie Bishop has emphasised is how we can partner with the private sector, tap philanthropy, work with the Gates Foundation, Bloomberg Foundation, other major foundations, and partner with them in an innovative way. So there's some very exciting things that are taking place, but really the barometer has to be not necessarily the dollar sign, but how far is that money going? What is actually occurring in those countries? And some of the results are very positive.
Helen wants to jump in. 20 seconds.
I agree. You can do a lot with philanthropy, and you can do a lot with different foundations, and
partners.
They are stepping up as well. But it doesn't mean that we don't need governments. We need governments, and I think it is very important to realise that. For example, the UK government, I live in London now, I used to live in Denmark, and you see Theresa May bringing their development budget up to 0.7, carrying on from David Cameron. And why does she do that? I think the Conservative Party wants to do that because they see helping in other countries, trying to help with the refugee situation, is actually an issue of homeland security. It's not only because it is morally good and the right thing to do, it is also a strategic choice. So I think that is how they're thinking it in other parts of the world.
You almost led us to our next question, so I'm going to go there. But remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. Keep an eye on our Twitter account and the Conversation website for fact checks by the experts. The next question comes from Usman Mahmood.
Yes. Sadly, the Syrian conflict has resulted in massive civilian casualties, mass migration, and infrastructure destruction. Are the Western countries taking serious steps to end the conflict and increase their foreign aid?
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. Look, logically, I'll go to Hella first on this because it's something of huge concern to you and to save the children. But this massive conflagration in Syria is probably the biggest story on the planet. We rarely get to talk about it.
Is the biggest story. I mean, look at Syria, what it was 7-8 years ago, quite a normal country. I was there. I met President Assad. It was beginning to become a normal country. Now we have 6 million people who have fled. We have half the population who have had to flee. And you have so many children who are traumatized, perhaps for life, about what has happened there. You are asking, is there any chance of the warring parties coming together? We see very, very slow progress, if any. And what I'm calling for, we in Save the Children are calling for now, could we at least engage in a Security Council agreement on just trying to have some rules of war that the warring party will live by, where you don't bomb schools, where you don't bomb hospitals, where you get access for humanitarian workers to get in and pick children and people up to get them to safe spaces and hospitals. There's still a lot we could be doing, and it's been very, very difficult to work in Aleppo and Idlib and others of those cities.
Just on the kind of strategic and political side of this, does the world have to, even those who hate him for various reasons, have to accept that Assad will remain in power, and that the path to peace is to have a strong, even dictatorial leader in a country like that? Because I'm not saying that myself, but a lot of people are. A lot of people are, and I don't actually want to go into that high political part of it. If you have to negotiate with him, you have to negotiate with at the end of the day. But until we get to that space, to that place, it is important that we just sit back and urge everyone who is a warring party in that conflict, and there are a few, to just live by some very simple rules where you should not be bombing a hospital, you should not be bombing humanitarian aid workers that are trying to get access into these cities, you should not be bombing schools. And we know about children that are in there. We have actually asked almost 450 children and families in there what they feel now, and you can imagine that the wounds that they have, they're not only all visible, some of them are invisible wounds where they actually have mental problems that they perhaps will never recover from. So we have asked them, we know exactly what's going on in there, and that's why I'm urging the Security Council to at least come together and set some rules for what should be happening. There's rules of war. There are actually rules that you have to abide by, and I hope that they will do that in the coming months and years. Paul, I'm going to bring you in. I just talk about invisible wounds. In a sense, the entire story is invisible to affluent people a long way away from it. Yes, we hear about the refugees and so on, but the war, the biggest story in the world, is barely talked about here.
Well, I think that's right. And in fact, I think it's barely talked about in quite a few countries. And I think one of the reasons for that is there's a sense of hopelessness about it. The outlook, as far as I can see, is pretty bleak at the moment. There have been efforts at negotiations. They haven't been successful. The degree of destruction and damage to human life is incomprehensible. The idea 10 years ago that this would have happened to Syria would have been beyond any sort of human understanding. And I think in that sense it defies our sense of humanity, it defies our political imagination, and the parties are locked in this conflict, and they seem to be willing at this stage to continue the conflict for their own particular objectives.
I'm just going to quickly go back to our question. Usman, you wanted to get in?
Who is funding the terrorists? Where they do get the weapons? So we should be cutting down the supplies to terrorists so that they can stop the fight.
Well,
Josh.
Well, one of the problems is that the major players are not just the Assad regime and ISIS. The Russians are heavily involved, and as you know, with a veto at the UN Security Council, that has put a block on united action through the UN. Iran is a Shiite country, and Assad is part of a minority group called the Alawites, only 13% of Syria, but a Shiite sect. And so Iran is heavily involved, providing support through Hezbollah to the Syrian regime. So and on the
other side of the equation, you've got the Saudis involved and other Gulf Arab states involved, funding the other side of the equation.
So it plays to a much bigger schism in the Islamic world between the Sunni and the Shiite sects. And the United States, famously, Obama said there is a red line here. If they use chemical weapons, then we'll take action. There's lots of evidence to suggest that red line was crossed, but no subsequent action was taken. You've got Trump in the White House who's got a different
just a quick question here, and we're really running out of time, but are you really suggesting the Americans should have gone in and sent troops into Syria in the way that they did in Iraq?
That's
the sort of threat once the red line is crossed.
Yeah, but those decisions are purely American decisions. It's not for us in Australia to be telling the Americans.
Well, they are our lead ally, and where they go, we tend to follow.
They are. Well, I'll take that as a comment, Tony.
Just take it as a historical fact.
But the point is, Obama did say that, and there has been lots of documentation by human rights groups that unconventional weapons have been used in Syria, and I find it harrowing. I find it devastating that 10 million people have either fled the country or been displaced, internally displaced. That's more than half the country, and the world is sitting by. I mean, if this doesn't show you how the UN has failed on a big crisis on its doorstep, then the Syrian...
Okay, I'm going to give you the final answer.
Oh, that's very nice.
And the question is, and we do look at this with a sense of hopelessness.
Yeah.
And looking at it from the point of view of a country so far away like Australia, what could we do?
Well, I want to say that while we talk about Syria, let's not forget that we have about 14 million right now who are in a serious situation, actually many in risk of famine in the Horn of Africa, in a really bad toxic mix in a cocktail between war and drought, climate change, poverty, everything that's happening there, and they are actually at a real risk of famine. So while we're discussing Syria, please let's not forget the Horn of Africa, where we have serious situation as well. And the only thing I want to say here at the end of the program, let's not give up. I mean, I know we have talked about climate change and all these very, very important things tonight, but we shouldn't give up. And the most important thing for all of us is that we can actually make a difference if we work together. That is what I see every day with Save the Children. And I hope that just more people will join up and believe that we can make a difference.
And very briefly, if you don't, the problems of the world pretty much end up on your doorstep, don't they?
We see it all. We work in 120 countries. We see everything that happens. And the reason why I'm here with Save the Children is that one day I got very, very angry by how this world treats its children. But I really, truly believe that we can change that. We can change how we see children, how we treat children, and Save the Children does that every day.
That's all we have time for tonight. I'm sorry to say, please thank our panel, Paul Kelly, Linda Burney, Mohammed Yunus, Helle Thorning-Schmidt and Josh Frydenberg. Now remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra. Tracy Holmes and her guest, global health expert Anne Boonde Birust will take talkback and discuss your comments and questions on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish here. Now, next Monday on Q&A, the Minister for Communications, Mitch Fifield, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, the singing, songwriting socialist Billy Bragg, acclaimed author Nikki Gemmell, whose latest book tackles the impact of suicide, euthanasia, a good death in the story of her own mother, and the Professor of Law and Ethics, Margaret Somerville, who is critical of the growing push for euthanasia. Until next week, good night.